Christmas Eve, 1945. The Sodder home stood on a hill outside Fayetteville, West Virginia, its windows bright with holiday warmth against the Appalachian winter dark. 10 children. Two parents who'd built everything from nothing. Inside, the scent of pine mixed with wood smoke, and the sugar, sweet promise of tomorrow's gifts. George and Jenny Sodder had crossed an ocean for this. For safety, for family, for the American dream that tasted like possibility. The children had performed their nativity play that evening, voices high and clear, echoing off wood-paneled walls. The 9 of them were home that night. The oldest had already left to build lives of their own. But 5, Morris, 14. Martha, 12, Lewis, 9, Jenny, 8, Betty, only 5 years old. 5 children who would go to bed on Christmas Eve and vanish before dawn broke. The fire started around 1 a.m. Jenny woke to the smell. Not wood smoke, but something chemical, something wrong burning through the floorboards beneath her. She shook George awake. The house was already filling with smoke thick as wet wool, clawing down their throats. They screamed for the children. 4 escaped. Marion, 17, scrambling out a window. Sylvia, 2, scooped from her crib. The 2 youngest boys pulled from rooms on the ground floor. But upstairs, the stairs were already engulfed. Flames licked up the walls with a hunger that seemed almost deliberate, blocking every path to the second story where 5 children slept, or should have been sleeping. George ran outside, tried to throw a ladder against the house. It wasn't where he'd left it. A gone. He ran for his coal truck. He'd drive it to the house, climb on the roof, break through from above. The truck wouldn't start. It had worked perfectly the day before. He plunged his hands into the water barrel they kept for emergencies. Frozen solid. In West Virginia, December, yes, but not like this. Not solid ice when it had been liquid the afternoon before. Not when the temperature hadn't dropped that low. The phone lines, cut. The fire department 8 miles away, not called until 8 a.m., 7 hours after the blaze began, by a man who'd driven into town to report it himself. By then, the house had collapsed into its own basement. By then, the Sodders stood in ash and snow, faces blackened, lungs raw, staring at the smoldering wreckage of everything they'd built, and listening. Listening for voices that never came. Listening for the screams they'd somehow never heard. Not once. Not from any of the 5 children trapped upstairs. How does a house full of children burn in silence? The fire chief arrived in the gray morning light. He surveyed the ruins with the casual efficiency of a man who'd seen tragedy before. "The children," Jenny said. Her voice scraped hollow. "We have to find, ma'am," he said, not meeting her eyes. The fire was too hot. There won't be anything left. But George knew fire. He'd worked with coal, with furnaces, with heat that could melt iron. And he knew that a wooden house fire, even fierce, even fast, doesn't incinerate bone. Doesn't consume 5 human bodies completely. Doesn't leave nothing. The chief told them to wait. To let the debris cool. To grieve. They waited 4 hours. Then George took a shovel and began to dig through the ruins himself, sifting through char and ash and twisted metal bed frames still warm to the touch, and found nothing. No bones. No teeth. No skulls, no trace. The fire chief called it complete combustion. An impossibility, whispered as fact. The coroner ruled all 5 children dead without examining a single remain. The death certificates were signed on faith alone. But absence of evidence is not evidence itself. And sometimes The missing scream louder than the dead. The ruins were still warm when the questions began to burn hotter than the fire ever had. George Sodder stood in the basement crater of his home, December wind cutting through his coat, and understood, with the clarity of a man watching his sanity fray, that nothing about this added up. The fire had been fast. Too fast. Witnesses, neighbors on the hillside, said the house was engulfed in under 20 minutes. But wooden structures don't explode into inferno. They smolder. They crackle. They give you time. This fire had moved like accelerant, like intent. George hired a private investigator, then another, then a crematorium operator to explain the science of burning human remains. The operator was blunt. To fully consume a human body, bones, teeth, everything, you need sustained temperatures above 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 hours. He paused. And even then, you'll still find fragments. Always fragments. A house fire burns at 100 degrees. Maybe 400 at peak intensity. The Sodder fire had burned for 45 minutes before collapsing. The math didn't just fail to add up. It laughed in their faces. Then came the discoveries that turned grief into suspicion. The ladder. George found it weeks later, thrown into a ditch 100 yards from the house, half buried in snow. Someone had moved it, deliberately. On Christmas Eve, the trucks. Both coal trucks examined by a mechanic. Distributor caps removed, or not broken, not worn, removed. Someone had sabotaged them the night of the fire. Someone who didn't want George reaching that second story. The phone lines. Cut. Not burned through, not melted, but severed. Before the fire began. And the fire department. The chief who dismissed the Sodders' search. Who'd told them to accept the ashes and grieve. He was also the county coroner. The same man who signed the death certificates without ever examining the scene thoroughly. The same man who later, years later, would admit he'd found a small human organ in the ruins. A heart, which he placed in a cardboard box and buried on the property, without testing, without examination, without telling the Sodders until they demanded answers. When they finally exhumed it for analysis, beef liver, not human, not child, beef liver planted in the ashes, Jenny began receiving letters. Cruel ones, anonymous ones. Your children are alive. Stop looking. They're better off where they are. Forget them. But one letter, came with no threat, only information. A woman in Charleston claimed she'd served 5 children breakfast on Christmas morning, 1945. Her children who'd arrived with a man and woman, quiet, pale, eating in silence. Children who looked exactly like the missing Sodders. When investigators followed up, the woman recanted. I said she'd been mistaken. Said she'd never seen them at all. But her hands shook when she said it. And her eyes. Her eyes went to the door, as if checking who might be listening. George stood at the edge of the property months later, staring at the concrete slab they'd poured over the basement ruins. A grave marker for children who might not be dead. The fire had taken his home. The authorities had taken his answers. But something deeper, something deliberate, had taken his children. And the more he searched, the more the evidence pointed away from tragedy and toward abduction. But who takes 5 children on Christmas Eve? And why would a town help them disappear? To understand what happened to the Sodder children, you must first understand who George Sodder was and who wanted him silenced. George Sodder was born Giorgio Soddu in Sardinia, Italy. He'd immigrated in 1908, built a life hauling coal, raising children, carving prosperity from Appalachian stone. But George was also loud, passionately, dangerously loud. By 1945, he'd become a vocal critic of Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism, speaking openly at community gatherings, donating to anti-Mussolini causes, arguing with anyone who'd listen, including members of the local Italian community who didn't appreciate his politics. One man in particular, a life insurance salesman who'd visited the Sodder home months before the fire. George had refused to buy a policy. The man had left angry, muttering threats in Italian as he walked down the front path. "Your house will go up in smoke, and your children will be destroyed." Jenny had heard it. She'd told George to be careful. But how do you protect your family from words that sound like madness? Until the night they become prophecy. Then there were the visitors. Weeks before Christmas, 2 men in dark suits had appeared at the Sodder home, claiming to be insurance adjusters. They'd asked intrusive questions, walked the perimeter of the house, examined the exits, the windows, the layout with the precision of men planning something more than paperwork. George had told them to leave. They'd smiled. Thin, cold smiles, and left without argument, but they'd mapped the house, every exit, every weakness, every place a ladder might stand. And on Christmas Eve, when the fire began, every exit they'd studied was either blocked, disabled, or removed. The FBI investigated briefly. They found nothing. Or rather, they found what they were allowed to find. Local authorities were uncooperative. Witnesses changed stories. Evidence disappeared. George began to suspect a conspiracy, not sprawling and cinematic, but localized and brutally efficient. A network of Italian sympathizers, still loyal to Mussolini even after the war, who saw George's outspoken defiance as betrayal, who saw his children as leverage, or as punishment. There were whispers, half heard, never confirmed, of families like the Sodders being rejudicated, of children taken to Italy, raised under new names, stripped of their American identities, and remade into loyal fascists. It sounded insane, but so did a house fire that left no bones. In 1949, George hired a private detective to travel to Italy, to follow a lead, a sighting, a rumor of American children in a Sicilian orphanage run by an organization with known fascist ties. The detective disappeared. Not metaphorically. He vanished in Palermo and was never heard from again. His last telegram to George: "Found something. Don't trust local authorities. Will contact soon." Soon never came. And George never stopped wondering what, or who, the man had found. Back in Fayetteville, the harassment continued. Strangers photographed the Sodder family from distant cars. Their mail was opened, resealed, delivered late. Jenny found footprints in the snow outside their windows. Watching, always watching. The Sodders erected a billboard along Route 16C, of 5 faces, 5 names. A reward for information. 5,000 reward for information leading to the return of our children. It stood for decades, weathered and fading. A monument to refusal, refusal to forget, refusal to accept, a refusal to let silence win. But the silence was vast. And the answers, if they existed, were buried under layers of complicity, fear, and the suffocating weight of secrets that entire communities agreed never to speak aloud. When a town chooses silence, who pays the price? 1968, 23 years after the fire, Jenny Sodder, grey now, worn by decades of searching, received an envelope postmarked from Kentucky. A no-return address. Inside a photograph. And 4 words scrawled on the back. Lois Sodder. I love brother Frankie. A lil boys. A nio 132. She held it under the kitchen light, hands shaking so violently the image blurred, and stared into the face of a young man, mid-20s, dark hair, Mediterranean features, who looked exactly like her son Louis might look if he'd survived. If he'd grown up. If he'd aged from 9 years old to 30, 2 in some hidden place, under some stolen name, with memories of a family erased or buried so deep they only surfaced in cryptic messages sent across state lines. The eyes. God? The eyes were Louis's eyes. George contacted the police in Kentucky. They investigated the return address. A motel, long since abandoned. No records, no guests, no trail. He hired a detective to trace ill boys. Nothing. A 90132. A code, a serial number, a reference that led nowhere. Brother Frankie, Frank Sodder, the eldest, who'd survived the fire and spent his life helping his parents search. Someone was sending a message. Someone wanted them to know Louis was alive. But not where, or not how, or not why. Was it real? Or was it cruelty? The worst kind, the hope-flavored kind that poisons slowly. Jenny had the photograph analyzed. Age progression specialists compared it to childhood photos of Louis. The conclusion: possible. Not definitive. Similarities are significant. Which meant maybe. And maybe was the most dangerous word in the English language for a mother who'd been searching for 2 decades. Maybe meant she couldn't stop. Maybe meant she couldn't grieve. Maybe meant every stranger's face on every street corner could be her child, aged and unknown, and she'd spend the rest of her life scanning crowds for ghosts who might still breathe. There were other sightings over the years. A woman in Florida swore she'd seen Betty, now a teenager, working in a diner, eyes hollow, responding to a different name. When confronted, the girl had run, disappeared into the kitchen, and never came out. By the time authorities arrived, she was gone. A truck driver claimed he'd picked up a hitchhiker in Tennessee who'd told him a story, rambling, half drunk, about being taken as a child, raised by strangers, forbidden to speak his real name. The man had mentioned West Virginia. A fire, a Christmas. But he'd gotten out at the next truck stop and vanished into the night. And the driver hadn't thought to write down his details until years later, when he saw the Sodder's billboard and felt the weight of what if settle in his chest. Were these the children, or were they echoes? Desperate projections, collective guilt, the human need to believe that lost things can be found. George died in 1969, 1 year after the photograph arrived. He died believing his children were alive. Taken, hidden, surviving somewhere. Jenny lived until 1989, 4 years after the fire. She died with Louis's photograph, pressed between the pages of her Bible, never knowing if the face in the image was her son or a stranger weaponized as hope. The surviving Sodder children, Marion, Sylvia, and the others, carried the weight forward. Some believed the abduction theory. Some thought their parents had been driven mad by grief, seeing patterns in chaos, finding meaning in meaningless coincidence. But all of them remembered the fire, the speed, the silence, the absence of remains. And all of them, no matter what they believed, agreed on one thing: the official story was a lie. But the truth remained locked behind too many years, too many deaths, Too many people who'd chosen silence over justice. And the dead keep their secrets better than the living ever could. Let's reconstruct the night, piece by piece, hour by hour, and see where the official story cracks open. Jenny Sodder is awakened, not by smoke, not by fire. By the telephone, it rings, once. Shrill in the Christmas Eve silence. She answers. A woman's voice on the other end, unfamiliar. Laughing softly in the background noise of a party or gathering. The woman asks for someone who doesn't live there. Wrong number. Jenny hangs up, confused. Returns to bed. But here's what matters. She smelled smoke even then. Faint. Acrid, before the fire was supposed to have started. Was the call a distraction? A signal? A mere way to ensure someone was awake to witness, but not soon enough to stop what was already in motion? 100 a.m. The fire begins. But where? Witnesses reported flames erupting from multiple points simultaneously. The roof, the attic, the ground floor. Not a single ignition spreading naturally, but coordinated, accelerated, deliberate. George would later find remnants of what he believed were fire accelerant devices. Small, scorched metal objects in the debris that didn't belong to any appliance in the house. Incendiary devices. Napalm. Homemade firebombs. The fire chief dismissed them as household debris. But George kept them anyway, locked in a box. Photographed, catalogued. Evidence of arson that was never officially investigated. 1:15 a.m. The chaos. George tries the ladder. Gone. Tries the trucks. Disabled. Tries the phone. Dead. Every contingency has been thought of. Every escape route closed. Every tool removed. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. But here's the question that haunts every reconstruction. If the goal was to kill the children, why not just let them die? Why go to such elaborate lengths? Sabotaging vehicles, cutting phone lines, ensuring the fire spread too fast for rescue, when you could simply bar the doors from outside and let nature take its course. Unless the fire wasn't meant to kill them. Unless the fire was cover. A spectacle. A misdirection. A proof of death where no death had occurred. 1:20 a.m. The silence. This is what haunted Jenny most. 5 children. Trapped upstairs in a burning house. And not one scream. Not one cry for help. Not one thud of a body hitting a door, a window, a floor. Children in terror don't go quiet. They shriek. They bang. They fight. But the Sodder children, if they were truly trapped, died without a sound. Or they were never trapped at all. Hypothesis. The back exit. The house had a rear staircase, narrow, unused, leading from the second floor to the back door. The fire blocked the main staircase, yes. But the back staircase. No one ever confirmed it was engulfed. No one checked. What if someone had already led the children down that staircase before the fire reached it? What if they were ushered out quietly, half asleep, confused, told they were being rescued? What if they walked, willingly, into the arms of whoever had orchestrated this, believing they were being saved, only to be driven away into a night that would swallow them for decades? Supporting evidence. A woman driving past the Sodder house around 1:30 a.m. reported seeing a figure standing in the yard, watching the fire. Not moving, not George, not a neighbor, someone else. Someone observing. A man in a nearby town claimed he'd seen children matching the Sodders. Descriptions being placed into a car on Christmas morning. Headed toward Charleston. He'd thought nothing of it at the time, assumed they were visiting relatives. But the timing, the descriptions, it fit. A Charleston hotel clerk came forward years later, saying 5 children had checked in on Christmas Day, 1945, with an Italian couple who paid cash, spoke little, and left no names. The clerk had found it strange. Children so quiet, so obedient, like they'd been trained not to ask questions. But when investigators tried to verify, the hotel records had been destroyed in a fire. Another fire. Always fire. Erasing trails. So here's the reconstruction that makes the most sense. The one that fits the evidence. The one that explains the silence, the sabotage, the lack of remains. The Sodder children didn't die in the fire. They were taken during the fire. Led out through the chaos by people they may have recognized, people they trusted. People who told them their parents were right behind them. And by the time Jenny and George realized the children were gone, they were already miles away, riding toward a new life under new names. Their memories of Christmas Eve 1945 fading into the haze of childhood trauma that never quite makes sense. But who would orchestrate such a thing? And how does an entire community help it succeed? Conspiracy theories are easy to dismiss. They are convenient refuges for grief, mad minds that can't accept randomness, can't accept that tragedy needs no architect. But sometimes, the conspiracy isn't theory. It's just conspiracy. The fire chief, Coroner's F.J. Morris, held both positions, fire chief and county coroner, a conflict of interest so blatant it screams. He declared the children dead without remains. He discouraged the Sodders from searching the ruins. He later admitted to finding a heart in the ashes, then buried it without testing, without informing the family, without any proper procedure. When it was finally exhumed and analyzed, a beef liver, planted. Why would a man in his position plant false evidence? To close a case. To stop questions. To protect what? Who? The insurance salesman. He'd threatened George months before the fire. Predicted that the house would burn and the children would be destroyed. After the fire, he was never questioned, never investigated. He left town within a year and disappeared from records entirely. Who was he? Just a bitter salesman. Or a messenger, delivering a warning George didn't take seriously until it was too late. The local authorities. Every attempt the Sodders made to investigate was stonewalled. FBI requests, ignored. Private detectives, harassed. Witnesses, intimidated into silence. One witness, a bus driver who claimed he saw the children being led to a car, recanted his statement after local police spoke with him. His family moved out of state within a month. Another, a store clerk, who said she'd seen Martha Sodder in a Charleston department store years later, was visited by men in suits who told her she was mistaken. Now she never spoke publicly again. This isn't grief, distorted paranoia. This is pattern. This is organized suppression. The Italian connection. George's anti-Mussolini stance had made him enemies. Not abstract ideological enemies, but local ones. Men who believed in the fascist cause even after Italy fell. Men who saw George's vocal opposition as betrayal. There were whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, of a network operating in immigrant communities across Appalachia. Families loyal to the old regime, helping re-educate the children of defectors, taking them to Italy, placing them with loyalist families, erasing their American identities. It sounds like pulp fiction, but in the chaos of post-war 1945, with intelligence networks fractured and immigration records a mess. It was possible. Disturbingly, horrifyingly possible. And if it happened to the Sodders, how many other families were silenced into forgetting? The town's silence, this is the part that haunts the most. And not the grand conspirators, not the shadowy figures, but the neighbors, the people who saw things, heard things, knew things, and said nothing. For decades. Because silence is easier than courage. Because complicity is safer than justice. Because when an entire community decides a truth is too dangerous to speak, that truth becomes heavier than bone, deeper than any grave, and more permanent than stone. George and Jenny weren't crazy. They were right. Right about the fire being arson. Right about the children being taken. Right about the conspiracy. But being right doesn't mean you win. Sometimes being right just means you get to carry the weight of knowing, alone. While the world insists you're mad, the Sodders carried it until they died, and their surviving children carry it still. When justice fails, when systems protect the guilty, when silence becomes policy, what's left for those who remember? Only the haunting. Only the rage. Only the terrible, enduring weight of knowing that somewhere, your stolen children might still breathe, under stolen names, dreaming stolen dreams, and you will never, ever find them. "79 years. Nearly 8 decades since 5 children vanished into Christmas Eve smoke. And still, the theories multiply like fractures in glass, each one reflecting a different nightmare. Theory 1. The mafia abduction. Not Italian fascists, mafia. George Sodder had crossed paths with organized crime during his coal hauling days. Refused to pay protection money. Refused to play along. The fire could have been punishment. The children leverage. Taken and trafficked, not to Italy, but deeper into America's underworld, a child labor. Black market adoption. Or worse. This theory explains the precision, the sabotage, the coordination, the disappearance of bodies. The mafia had resources, connections, and a brutal efficiency in making problems vanish. But if this was mafia retribution, why did George survive? Usually, the message is written in blood. The whole family, not just the children. Unless keeping George alive to suffer was the real punishment, not death. A haunting. Theory 2. The psychiatric experiment. This one sounds absurd until you remember 1945. The tail end of World War II. Government-sanctioned experiments on unwitting civilians weren't conspiracy theories. They were documented fact. MKUltra. Tuskegee. Her Operation Paperclip. What if the Sodder children were taken as subjects? A test cases for psychological conditioning. Identity erasure, trauma response studies. Why, what if they were placed with government-affiliated families, their memories suppressed, their identities rewritten? The FBI's refusal to investigate takes on a different tone through this lens. Not incompetence. Protection. Protection of something classified, something sanctioned, something too dark to admit, and the photograph of Lewis in 1968. I thought maybe it wasn't hope. Maybe it was a leak. Someone in the program, conscience-stricken, sending proof that the children were alive, but too embedded in new lives to ever be returned. Theory 3. The family secret. This is the theory the Sodder descendants hate most. That there was no abduction. That the children died in the fire. And George and Jenny, broken by grief, constructed an elaborate delusion to cope. That every sighting was coincidence or misidentification. That every piece of evidence was reinterpreted through the lens of desperate hope. That the photograph was a stranger, or a cruel hoax, or a case of mistaken identity. But this theory collapses under scrutiny. The sabotage, real, documented, confirmed by multiple investigators. The lack of remains, impossible under normal fire conditions. The witness statements, consistent, despite years between them. No, the family secret theory is the one people want to believe because it's comfortable. It's closure. It's neat, but closure is a luxury the truth doesn't always afford. Theory 4. The children survived and chose silence. The darkest theory of all. What if the children were found years later? What if Louis, Martha, Maurice, Jenny, and Betty grew up in new families, under new names, and eventually learned who they'd been? And what if they chose not to come home? Stockholm Syndrome. A brainwashing. A fear of the truth being worse than the lie. What if they'd been told their parents were dead, or abusive, or criminals? What if they built lives so far removed from their origins that returning would destroy them? Their marriages, their children, their identities. What if the 1968 photograph was Louis's way of saying, "I remember, but I can't come back"? This theory is the one that breaks hearts, because it means the Sodders could have been so close. Their children alive, breathing, living full lives, but forever out of reach, not by cruelty, by choice, by the unbearable weight of knowing that reunion would cause more pain than peace. The truth. Here's what we know. The fire was arson. The children's bodies were never found. Multiple witnesses reported sightings over decades. The investigation was sabotaged from the inside. Here's what we don't know. Where the children went. Who took them. Whether they lived to adulthood. Whether they ever remembered their real names. And here's what haunts. Somewhere in America, or Italy, or beyond, there might be elderly people in their 70s and 80s who carry fragments of a memory. A house on fire. Voices calling in the dark. The smell of pine and smoke and terror. And they don't know, can't know, that those fragments are the keys to a mystery their biological family spent decades trying to solve. When memory itself is stolen, when identity is erased, what's left? Only ghosts, only questions, only the terrible, infinite echo of what if. The billboard stood for 44 years. Through rain, through snow, through the slow decay of paint and wood and hope, 5 faces, frozen in childhood, never aging, never found. George Sodder erected it in 1950, 5 years after the fire, when every official door had closed and every lead had dead-ended. It was his final weapon, public memory. Refusal to forget. And for decades, drivers along Route 16 outside Fayetteville, West Virginia, would pass it, glance up, feel the weight of those young faces, and wonder, did anyone ever find them? The surviving Sodder children took it down in 1989, after Jenny died. Not because they'd found answers. Because carrying their mother's hope had become too heavy. Because some griefs don't heal, they just calcify into shapes you learn to live around. Marion Sodder, the eldest daughter who'd escaped through a window, lived until 2024. She was 96 years old. And until the end, she'd say, "I don't know what happened to my brothers and sisters. But I know they didn't die in that fire. Certainty without proof. A faith without evidence. The terrible burden of knowing when the world insists you're wrong." The Sodder case has never been officially solved. It remains open, technically, though no active investigation exists. The FBI file is sealed. The local records are incomplete or lost. The witnesses are dead. And the children, if they survived, would be in their 80s now, scattered across the world, their memories of Christmas Eve 1945 either buried so deep they'll never surface, or surfacing every December in dreams they can't explain, in phantom smells of smoke and pine, in a nameless grief that has no origin they can name. What the Sodder case teaches us, that the absence of remains doesn't mean death. That official narratives can be lies wrapped in authority. That conspiracies don't need to be sprawling to be effective, just localized, just committed, just silent enough. That sometimes, the cruelest thing isn't death, it's ambiguity. The not knowing. The maybe. The endless echoing what if. George and Jenny Sodder weren't crazy. They were betrayed. By their community, by their investigators, by a system that valued closure over truth. And their children, maybe they're buried in unnamed graves. Maybe they lived full lives under stolen names. Maybe they're still out there, elderly, uncertain, carrying fragments of a memory that never quite fits. Or maybe, they're watching from some distant place, unable to return, unable to explain, unable to bridge the gap between who they were and who they've become. And the tragedy isn't just the loss. It's the distance. The unbridgeable, infinite distance between what was stolen and what can never be reclaimed. The final question on Christmas Eve. When snow falls on Appalachian hills and houses glow with holiday warmth. Do 5 elderly souls somewhere feel a pull they can't explain? Do they dream of a house on fire? Do they wake with tears they don't understand? Reaching for siblings whose names they've forgotten? Or are they simply gone, erased so completely that even their ghosts don't know where to haunt? The Sodder children's story isn't just about what happened. It's about what could happen. How easily a family can be shattered. How thoroughly a crime can be hidden. How long a community can keep a secret. And how parents can love their children so fiercely that they spend decades searching, hoping, refusing to believe the lie they've been told, even when belief becomes suffering. Even when hope becomes poison. Even when the only comfort left is the terrible certainty that somewhere, somehow, they're still out there. On a hillside in West Virginia, a concrete slab still marks the spot where the Sodder house once stood. No bodies beneath it. No answers in the soil. Just stone, and then silence. And the endless, unanswerable question, where did they go, and why? After 79 years, has no one ever told.